Good evening. My name is Mike Gomez, and I am the director for the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora here at New York University. And as part of our speaker series, we are delighted to have with us Professor Ayodeji Ogunnaike. Professor Ogunnaike is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Bowdoin College, where he teaches interdisciplinary courses on Africa and the African diaspora that center around the important role religion plays in these communities. Professor Ogunnaike's research focuses mostly on Yoruba, Orisha worship in Nigeria, but also addresses Islam in Africa, Christianity in Africa, and diasporic religions, Brazilian candomblé in particular. Having studied Ifa divination with a high priest and diviner in Nigeria, he has a keen interest in indigenous African intellectual traditions and ways of knowing. His current book project, Forms of Worship: How Orisha Devotion Became Religion in Nigeria and Brazil, analyzes how the worship of traditional Yoruba deities originally differed greatly from Western notions of religion, but eventually became the most widespread and celebrated indigenous African religion through contact with modernity and mission Christianity. He is also currently working on a major anthology and a children's book of Yoruba mythology with his brothers Oludamini and Olumakindi, and has been developing and curating on an online library of Ifa literature. The recent work he will present to us today, entitled Muslim Black Atlantic, documents and analyzes the dynamic communities formed by African Muslims in diaspora and how they influence the practice of Islam in West African homelands. I want to welcome you to Professor Ogunnaike's presentation. Professor Ogunnaike, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Professor Gomez, for the invitation. And thank you to everybody from CSAAD, for especially those of you who are here in person, then those of you who are attending online. I know we're very close to spring break and everybody is probably very tired and that it's cold and windy outside. So thank you to those of you who came in person for braving the weather to be here. As Professor Gomez stated, my presentation today is the Muslim Black Atlantic, the hidden participation of African Muslims in Black Atlantic modernity, roughly in the 19th century to the early parts of the 20th century. And I got started on this line of research because I was initially trained as an Africanist studying religion in Nigeria. And then when I started doing some research in Brazil, first on candomblé and syncretism with Catholicism, when I came back to Nigeria, I started to see, after looking for Africa in Brazil, I started to see Brazil in Africa all over the place in ways that I hadn't really noticed before, or I'd noticed, but I didn't fully appreciate what was going on. And the more I started looking into it, the more I realized that it had to be part of what I wrote my dissertation on, the ways that Brazilian traditions, when they were brought back to Yoruba land, actually had a profound influence on the way traditional Yoruba religion, or what we would call that today, was formed. But then as I started to pay more attention to what I saw going on in places like Lagos and looking at the literature, I realized that almost nobody was talking about the Muslims within that community of Brazilian returnees specifically, and that there were a surprisingly large percentage of the population of returnees, which made it seem even more important to me that somebody begin to do some work in that area. So that's where this research really started to begin. And I'd like to start the presentation with a brief description of the inauguration of the Shitabe Mosque, which is a mosque that's still standing today. It's a national landmark in Nigeria, and it was one of the most prominent mosques built out of non-perishable materials in colonial Lagos just before the turn of the century. So it was funded almost entirely, if not entirely, by a Sierra Leonean returnee named Mohammed Shitabe, and you can see his face right here. And it cost the astounding amount at that point in time of somewhere between £3,000 to £7,000. And he's believed to have bankrolled the whole thing himself. And he amassed this incredible wealth through Atlantic commerce. He was a very successful trader who had been educated by British missionaries in Sierra Leone. And when the mosque was inaugurated, the who's who of all of Lagosian society was there. The most prominent Christian clergymen were all in attendance. The colonial governor himself with all of his attachés came. There was a representative of the Ottoman Sultan, Mr. Abdullah Quilliam, who was the leader of the British Muslim Association, had come to confer the title of Bey, and that's why it's called the Shitabe Mosque. He conferred the title of Bey onto Muhammad Shita as a recognition of his philanthropic efforts in support of Islam in West Africa. And so you can see here a picture taken shortly after the inauguration of the mosque. And as I said, Muhammad Shitabe is here. Seated here is the traditional king of Lagos. This man here, Edward Wilmot Blyden, whom some of you may be familiar with, he was one of the first Pan-Africanists. He was born in the Danish West Indies, but traveled fairly widely in West Africa and published a lot of literature on religion and society in West Africa. And then a number of other prominent indigenous Yoruba figures who were nonetheless involved in the colonial administration were there as well. After the inauguration, a prominent Lagosian newspaper described the mosque as the finest example of ecclesiastical architecture anywhere in West Africa. And it really put the Muslim community in Lagos and Yorubaland on the map on a kind of international scale. And it resulted in a fair amount of respect and prestige in Lagosian society, and then also with the colonial administration. Right, so it very much elevated the position and the reputation, not only of Muhammad Shitabe himself, but of the whole Muslim community in Lagos. And Muhammad Shitabe is one of the best examples of what I call a Muslim Black Atlantic identity, as he was born in Sierra Leone, so in diaspora himself, to Aku, or what we would now call Yoruba parents. And he was born in Sierra Leone to Yoruba parents because his parents had been swept up in the Atlantic slave trade, but a British slave patrol, after the British had outlawed the slave trade, scooped them up and then, quote unquote, repatriated them to Sierra Leone. And that's where he was born. And he received both a certain element of Islamic and then also Western mission education in Sierra Leone. Moved with his father to Badagry and then Lagos later after some political turmoil. And in Lagos is where he really became fabulously wealthy through his engagement with Atlantic commerce. And the Shitabe Mosque was not the only project that he financed. He financed a lot of modern development projects, such as creating street lamps in his quarter in Lagos when the colonial government was too slow to do it. He also built lots of mosques and schools in lots of other places in West Africa, not just in Yorubaland, but also in Sierra Leone and a few other places. And he was also one of the leading figures in petitioning the colonial administration for greater representation of Africans and Muslims in colonial governance and law, and even advocated for the integration of Islamic law into colonial administration along the lines of what was done in India, because he was connected with the events that were taking place there. His family still bears this title Bey that was conferred on him by the Ottoman Sultan, And he also acquired the traditional title Sheriki Musulumi, which is oftentimes described as like a secular leader of the Muslim community. So he held this title through popular support rather than Islamic scholarship, which is usually the way that a lot of the Islamic traditional titles are held. And he isn't appointed by the traditional ruler. It was just because of his prominence in the Muslim society at the time. He enjoyed widespread respect and support from the colonial administration, and then had very cordial relationships and a fair amount of collaboration with the Christian Saro, and Saro is the name of Sierra Leonean returnees to Lagos at the time, and then also the Aguda, who are the Brazilian returnees at the time. So he had this very interesting way of collaborating with a very diverse group of figures. He was a very transnational and kind of trans-ethnic figure himself, whose prominence and power and identity was wrapped up both in his practice and identity of Islam, but also his engagement with modern education, Atlantic commerce, collaboration with Christians and colonial administration, and all of those things. And all of this is very characteristic of what I call the Muslim Black Atlantic. To give you a general overview of how we'll proceed, I'll briefly go over the presence of African Muslims in the Atlantic diaspora, talk about the reasons why Muslim returnees in West Africa have historically been overlooked in the literature, talk a bit about the reverse, or what I would call circular migration or movement of people around the Atlantic, and then address the important issues of education, architecture and material culture, and then focus on the transnationalism and a kind of alternate modern identity that was created by this Muslim community. And then finally, we'll end with the continued or lasting legacy of this population and the dynamics of their identity. So many of you in attendance will likely know a fair amount of this information, so I hope you'll bear with me as I just go over it quickly so we're all on the same page. But African Muslims have in essence been part of the Atlantic world from the very beginning. So when the Spanish started traveling to the Americas, people like Professor Gomez have written extensively on the presence of Ladinos in the Atlantic world, or people of African descent who either perhaps continued to be Muslims or had ties to Muslim identity, but had been Hispanicized and traveled with the Spanish across the Atlantic. Early on in the transatlantic slave trade, a large percentage of those who were enslaved and brought to the Americas came from the Senegambian region. Valdemar, since you're here, you know, when people talk about bolsa de mandinga, right, these mandinga bags, the reason why that's used even for all kinds of things that might not be Muslim in nature is because the Portuguese were first exposed to them in the context of West African Muslims. Right? So Senegambians and their practice of Islam also greatly influenced the nature of this population. But the biggest and most prominent influence on what I call the Muslim Black Atlantic was the West African jihads of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And this was mostly taking place in what's now called the Central Sudan. So the creation of states following the movements of figures like Usman Dan Fodio or Al-Hajj Omar Tal. And as a result, the ethnic groups that were primarily involved in this were the Fulani, the Hausa, the Yoruba, Kanuri, and Nukwe, amongst several others. And of course, these are the terms we'd use today. We might have used others in the past. But the concentration of these Muslims who were involved in the Atlantic slave trade around this era were found mostly in Sierra Leone as a result of the British anti-slavery patrols, and then in Brazil, because of course Brazil had the largest population of enslaved Africans, and especially at this point in time when the slave trade had been abolished in many other parts of the Atlantic world. What many people aren't as aware of is the surprisingly large number of African Muslims who were involved in this trade. So over 50, it's estimated that over 50% of those enslaved who came from the Central Sudan in the first half of the 19th century were Muslim themselves. And that's directly a result of Usman Dan Fodio's creation of the Sokoto Caliphate. And at the turn of the 20th century, Nina Rodriguez estimated that 1/3 of African-born people in Salvador were Muslim. Right? So Muslims formed a huge percentage of the African population, especially in Brazil, but also in Sierra Leone. And many of these figures still stand out in the colonial literature because their literacy and their pride in their identity differentiated them not only from other Africans, but even from some of the Euro-Brazilians when we're talking about Brazil, or even some of the British people in colonial Sierra Leone. And although some have argued against this, I think I'm fully convinced that there are a large number of people who converted to Islam, or at least began engaging in Islam in diaspora. And then some of them brought a Muslim identity and practice back with them to West Africa. So some of the reasons why I think there hasn't been a lot of work done on this particular issue that I'm trying to tackle with my current work is that there are a number of disciplinary barriers. So the very helpful framework of the Black Atlantic, developed by Paul Gilroy, of course, didn't focus too much on religion and was largely Anglophone in nature, and was limited to those kinds of communities. So the US and Great Britain primarily, and then a bit with Anglophone West Africa. But also Afro-diasporic religion, so thinking about religion brought from Africa into the diaspora, is usually dominated by non-Abrahamic traditions. So Candomblé, Haitian Vodou, Regla de Ocho, or Santeria in Cuba, and sometimes Christianity as well. But Islam usually doesn't factor very much into that. Only a few scholars like Sylviane Diouf or Edward Curtis or Professor Gomez have written extensively on the presence of Islam in the African diaspora. There's also very frequently a divide between African studies and the African diaspora. Those who work in diaspora will engage with the literature from African studies to a certain extent, but you very rarely see it going in the opposite direction, right? Those who are doing African studies very frequently don't focus as much on what's going on in diaspora. And all of this renders the returnees less legible, right? And they attract far less attention, I think, from the scholarship. But there are also colonial and linguistic barriers. So this Muslim Black Atlantic identity crosses a number of colonial barriers. So you'd have to deal with Portuguese, English, French, Arabic, and then also a number of different African, indigenous African languages as well. And because of the assumed hegemony of Christians and Europeans in colonial modernity, oftentimes Muslims get left out of the picture as well. So one of the most famous West African historians, Ade Ajayi, has a really wonderful book about how Christian missions created the new elite in colonial Nigeria. And he's absolutely right about that, but he focuses on the Christians who were created as a result of that educational endeavor. And although he recognizes the importance of returnees, he doesn't pay much attention to the fact that not everyone who went through that Christian educational system was Christian or was Christian at the end of it. So he also didn't pay attention to the presence of Muslims there. The Muslim Black Atlantic identity and experience also complicates commonly assumed binaries such as Islamic versus Western, colonial versus indigenous, modern versus traditional, Muslim, Christian, diaspora, and homeland. So in some ways, they kind of cross both of those divides to varying degrees. And this book over here is one of my favorites, Black Atlantic Religion, by Professor Matori, who's now at Duke. He's one of the few people who I think very well combines this study of diaspora and African studies and finding the diaspora in Africa. But again, he focuses almost exclusively on Candomblé, and he does an excellent job of it there. But he's focused on what we would call a traditional religion rather than Islam. And so to steal a term from Pierre Verger, in the 19th century, there was this great flux and reflux movement of people and ideas and goods across the Atlantic between mostly West Africa and Brazil. And there was constant contact between these two areas, mostly as a result of the Atlantic slave trade. But in particular, after 1835, when there was the Malay Rebellion in Bahia, there was a huge return migration. It's estimated to be about or just over 8,000 people left Brazil to travel to the Bight of Benin, this area here. And they settled everywhere from along major port cities from Accra in this area to Lagos, and then also inward after that. Also during the 19th century, there was a fair amount of repatriation in Sierra Leone. So the British anti-slavery patrols, when they would capture slave ships, they would repatriate those they found on board in Sierra Leone to over here, mostly in Freetown. And because of this constant movement between the Bight of Benin and Brazil, mostly Bahia here, and then also Freetown and Lagos, between these two nodes here, there was constant movement along multiple different nodes on the Atlantic. There was so much movement of people and goods and ideas that the British colonial government even sponsored a steamship line directly between Bahia and Lagos that ultimately went defunct, but they thought it would be a good investment. And Africans who had roots in Brazil and then also some in Sierra Leone made very creative use of passports and claims on citizenship or subjecthood. So Africans after 1835, because of very repressive legislation, were frequently barred from re-entry into Brazil because the Brazilians were afraid of an influence of rebellion because they had just had so many of them. But because trade was so lucrative, many Africans who had left Brazil got British passports and then would travel back to Brazil and enter as British subjects. So they couldn't be denied. They could appeal to the power of the British consul in Brazil to allow them re-entry and the ability to trade or connect with family members and those kinds of things. And they would do a similar thing when they were traveling in the Bight of Benin or when they wanted to travel inland. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But as I started looking into all of this, it got me thinking about how Islam has always spread through trade routes. And anytime you have Muslims engaged in trade, Islam spreads along with them. And we tend to think of that in the context of the trans-Saharan trade and then also the Indian Ocean trade. But we very rarely actually think of it in the context of Atlantic trade. What's unique about it, and I think the reason why we tend not to think of it in that context, is that the Atlantic trade was dominated by Europeans, whereas the other two trade traditions were dominated by Muslims themselves. So Muslims from Africa and in the diaspora who engaged in this trade traded in many of the same general materials that others did: palm oil, cloth, the slave trade itself, cola nuts, and several other materials. But there was also a more minor trade in Islamic materials: tasbih or prayer beads, red and blue ink that couldn't get produced locally in the diaspora, Qur'ans, and in fact, there's a French bookstore in Rio de Janeiro in the late 20th century, or sorry, the late 19th century. Dupont and Fauchon, their bestseller was the Qur'an. They sell over 100 copies of it every year, and their clientele, in essence, were African Muslims and their descendants. So it was their bestseller for quite a long time. And then, of course, there was lots of other written material that was traded along these trade routes. One of the other aspects of this trade was modern skills and crafts that were acquired in diaspora, both in Sierra Leone and in Brazil, and a few other minor places. But crafts and skills like carpentry or bricklaying or tailoring or things like that, that weren't traditional trades that West Africans were involved in, or at least not in that way, but they were exposed to as part of their experience in the Atlantic diaspora. And this is why they tended to settle along emerging Atlantic port cities. The vast majority of them were not originally from those specific areas, but after their experience in diaspora, they realized that they could leverage their knowledge of the modern world, to a certain extent, modern education for those who had it, and their knowledge of Atlantic commerce, that it could be very lucrative for them and that they would be best positioned to prosper in those environments, perhaps even more so than the indigents. And so all of this gave them a source of independent wealth, a fair amount of political and economic and social success, and a fair amount of prominence when they did resettle in those areas along the west coast of Africa. If you know much about the history of Islam in Africa, you know that trade and education, or trade and scholarship, always kind of go hand in hand. Merchants are oftentimes scholars and scholars are oftentimes merchants, and the same was true in the Muslim Black Atlantic. I have one article I call Bilad Brazil, in which I argue that the intellectual tradition of Bilad Sudan, or the West African region, was extended into Brazil in much the same way that the Sahara kind of linked an intellectual tradition there. The Atlantic Ocean, I argue, united an intellectual sphere from West Africa in Brazil. The high literacy rates of those in diaspora, both Sierra Leone and in Brazil, impressed all of the European travelers and officials. Those who traveled in those areas all noticed the large number of Muslims who were there and commented on the fact that sometimes the literacy rates and the degree of literacy was higher amongst that population than sometimes even like the Euro-Brazilians, for example. The unique nature of Brazilian urban slavery also created unique opportunities to recreate this intellectual tradition. And so because there was this tradition of ganadores, or urban enslaved people who had a certain amount of control over their association with other people, their labor and where and how they spent their time, all they had to do was send a certain amount of money to their so-called masters at regular intervals. So they could choose to live with other people and work with whoever they wanted as long as they contributed that money. What that meant was they could live with other Muslims, they could be trained by other Muslims or taught by other Muslims while they were waiting to be hired by other people. But it also meant that they could form associations. And so they very frequently recreated rotating credit associations that were very popular in West Africa at the time. So they would pool all of their resources, whatever money they had left over after sending some to their masters, they would use and pool and buy their freedom in turn, one person at a time. And in that way, they could collectively lift themselves up out of a state of slavery. As a result of all of this, there was a lot more time and opportunity to study and continue the Islamic educational tradition, and imams were appointed in practically every major port city in Brazil, with Salvador being the center. That was the kind of main seat. And this is very similar to the way that Islamic communities were structured in, say, Yoruba land or Hausa land, where most of the African Muslims in Brazil came from. They produced a truly remarkable quantity of intellectual material, both locally and they had some imported from West Africa. But most of this is actually overlooked because of a preoccupation with rebellion. The Brazilian colonial officials couldn't translate these materials. They didn't know what they were, so they frequently destroyed a lot of them. And even when they were studied, very frequently scholars looked at them within that context of rebellion, thinking about them as seditious material or organizing some kind of rebellion or revolt, when in matter of fact, it seems like most of the material actually didn't have much to do with rebellion at all, although some certainly did. Some of the Islamic scholars did return to West Africa to study and trade, and then some of them even returned back to Brazil afterward. And there's evidence that the intellectual community in Brazil was still producing new scholars through the 20th century. And there are accounts of exactly how that happened and, rough estimates about the numbers and those kinds of things. When these prominent scholars returned to West Africa, they led and in some cases even founded the Muslim communities in major West African port cities. So like in the West African city of Ague, for example, several of the chief imams there are from the Da Gloria family, which is a Returni or Aguda family from Brazil. And because they had exposure to Western or secular education in diaspora, whether they had a fair amount of it or not, they understood its importance for activity in a modern world and how this world was expanding and what the opportunities or possibilities for them in it would be. And so they embraced both of these educational traditions, one alongside the other, rather than splitting them up or resisting one in favor of the other. And the dynamics here were fairly similar to those in Sierra Leone, but in Sierra Leone, they had the added benefit of links with the traditional center of Islamic learning in Fouta Djallon, which wasn't too far away. And so one of the leaders of this diaspora community in Sierra Leone, Mohamed Yadaleo, himself did that. He received a certain amount of education in Freetown in Sierra Leone, traveled to Fouta Djallon to acquire extra study, and then came back and became the leader of the Muslim community there. One of the most prominent aspects of the Muslim Black Atlantic culture is architecture. And as you can see here, just like the slide I had at the beginning, there's a very curious fact about this in that many of the mosques that were built during this time period look like Brazilian churches, which always confused me when I was younger. I would move around in different places in Nigeria, and I saw a large number of these mosques, which I assumed at first were churches, and I couldn't understand why they were built that way. And nobody could ever actually give me a very good answer to it. But it was in studying this connection between the diaspora and homeland that it began to get a bit clearer for me. And it emerged because those who were taken to Brazil and then returned had been heavily involved in colonial Brazilian construction projects. And when they brought the tradition back to West Africa, it became the style of choice for new, wealthy, and upwardly mobile people all over the coast. And in fact, I learned that the traditional Yoruba style of houses, which has a kind of central hallway with rooms off on the side, I always assumed was the way Yoruba people had built their houses for centuries. But in fact, it's designed after the Brazilian sobrado, and it is a fundamental and radical shift that took place around the turn of the 20th century. So it expanded to touch practically all of the architectural traditions in this particular area, first in Lagos and then also inland. But the irony, of course, and there's a great historian of art and architecture, John Picton, who drew attention to this, I think in the 80s or 90s, but it hasn't been fully explored, is that the greatest expression of Brazilian ecclesiastical architecture in West Africa is found in mosques. And part of the reason why this is the case, of course, is because Brazilian returnees could appeal to a shared history and culture of Brazilian architecture that wasn't just tied to the Catholic Church, but of course found its greatest expression there. And because they weren't tied to the same kind of confessional categories or divisions that we might be now, they thought, well, this is just the way that you do sacred architecture, or this is the way you make buildings look as beautiful as you possibly can. This is the way you demonstrate transnational connections, a transatlantic connection, and this is the way you demonstrate your wealth and your affluence and your prominence in society, because that's the way the tradition had worked in Brazil. But most interestingly, I found when I was doing research on the Iberian tradition of creating this particular type of church, I found that many of these churches were actually literally built on the foundation of mosques that had been built by the Almoravids or the Almohads. And a number of the architectural features that they contain, in addition to just the foundations, are derived directly from Islamic architectural traditions. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the square minarets and how that was a prominent feature that reemerged in West Africa. But the reason why architecture is so prominent is that wherever Afro-Brazilians, or they were just called Brazilians when they had returned to West Africa, wherever they recreated this architectural tradition, European administrators and travelers were always arrested by them. They always remarked that these were the most beautiful and the most sophisticated buildings that they found anywhere in the colonies. In fact, one of the colonial administrators of Lagos was literally stopped in his tracks when he saw one of these square bell towers that had been built for the Holy Cross Cathedral, a Catholic church. And he asked, who built this? Where did this come from? Because it was very different from the English model of architecture. When he was informed that it was João Batista da Costa, a returnee from Brazil, he said, I had no idea that Africans were capable of producing something like this, which is, of course, very racist. But he said, if they are capable of this type of architectural feat, we should create a program to send them to England to learn architecture and construction, and then we can bring the light of civilization through architecture throughout, the whole expanding colony. And he did create that kind of program, but to his dismay, the English tradition of architecture very much failed in colonial Nigeria. And the local authorities, prominent traditional political figures and merchants preferred to send young craftsmen to Brazil, actually, to learn the Brazilian tradition of architecture and then bring it back. So they mostly neglected the English side of things there. And so transnationalism was a huge part of this emerging modern Muslim identity. And during the 19th century, especially the second half, it's fairly well documented that there was a huge ethno-national and transnational identity formation. So what we would call the Yoruba people now were not necessarily called Yoruba then. In fact, the word Yoruba only referred to a much smaller subgroup of people from that area. But it was in the process of the experience in diaspora and then repatriation that a kind of cultural pan-ethnicity was created. And this was taking place in many areas in West Africa. And this experience of diaspora was very central for it. And Islam in particular was one of the most prominent trans-ethnic forces in diaspora. So in addition to just meeting other people who spoke a similar dialect or had similar cultural and religious traditions, Islam could forge ties between communities that had even very different ethnic backgrounds. The movement within Africa, from places as far away as Freetown all the way down to Lagos, fostered a greater sense of transnationalism. So for somebody like Mohammed Shitabe, for example, and they cut across multiple different colonial linguistic and geographic divides, because you'd have people who, say, had come from what we could call Yoruba land now, and then were repatriated in Sierra Leone and then traded in Dahomey and Badagry and Lagos, cutting across British and then French colonial divides, and then also those who were coming from Brazil, a Portuguese colony, and then later on its own country, and then trading in French and English areas as well. They creatively invoked membership in multiple different imagined communities: British, Brazilian, Islamic, and African, Proto, and somewhat nationalist. And this picture here was something that really shocked me to find in my research. In the late 1850s and then 60s, the British consul in Lagos had such a large number of African Muslims returning through Lagos and then moving to other areas that it started issuing passports in Arabic. And I think the text is probably a bit too small to read, but for those of you who read Arabic, you might see that it says it's the British consulate or consul in Lagos, and it invokes the power of the Queen of Great Britain or of England, and then also the authority of the Ottoman Sultan to ensure safe passage for, and the person's name is handwritten in here, through Yoruba land, Nupe land, and a certain element of Hausa land as well. And so there's a huge movement of people across this general area. And because Muslims formed such a large part of it, the colonial administration started producing passports in Arabic to help them to facilitate their movement. And this was because they had appealed to the colonial government, again, appealing to British authority, and then also to a kind of transnational Islamic authority through the Sultan of the Ottoman Sultan. And in this way, you could see that these kind of modern Black Atlantic Muslims were fostering ties with the broader Islamic world and established kind of established traditional Islamic authorities. And this is why this man, Abdullah Quilliam, was such an interesting character. He was white, he wasn't Black, but because he was a very prominent British citizen who had converted to Islam, and he was in contact with the Ottoman Sultan, he played a very key role in this introduction of Ottoman involvement in West African Islam. He had been in touch with the Muslim communities in Sierra Leone and then also in Lagos because of their ability to speak the English language between both groups. And so when the Shitebe Mosque was inaugurated, those in Sierra Leone and in Lagos contacted him to get in touch with the Ottoman Sultan on their behalf. And that's why the Ottoman Sultan ultimately sent him. Right? And so it's this connection across the Atlantic that mediated the connection with the preeminent Muslim power of the time. And so to give you a kind of more concrete example of one of the scholars, since we already dealt with the merchant, one of the scholars who I think is very emblematic of the dynamics of the Muslim Black Atlantic, there's this really wonderful book that I'd encourage anybody who has the time to read. It's recently been translated into English, The Story of Rufino. His African name, we think was Abunkare. I think it's most likely Abu Bakri or Abu Bakari. He was born in Oyo to a scholarly lineage in the early 1800s. It's not clear exactly when. He bought his freedom in Brazil while in Brazil and served as a cook on a Brazilian slave ship. And he was caught by a British anti-slavery patrol and taken to Freetown while awaiting trial there. And he studied, he conducted a little less than a full year of study in Freetown amongst the kind of diaspora Muslim community in the area there. And he he returned to Sierra Leone again in 1845, this time completely voluntarily, for 19 months of further study. And here he actually connected with that figure I had talked about before, Muhammad Yadaleu. And when he finished his study in Sierra Leone, he returned to Brazil, first to Salvador and then to Recife, to set up a very profitable practice based on his Islamic scholarship that supported his dispersed family, mostly in Brazil. And I can't remember if there were any in Africa at the time. But another man, Paulo José Ferreira, he was born in Brazil to enslaved parents, but then was taken when he was very young to Lagos, where he was raised in a Muslim community and received Muslim education. But then at a certain point, he decided to return to Brazil, set up his own practice in Rio, and was able to support and stay connected with his family in Cano, Lagos, and then other places in Brazil. Right, so you can see how there are all of these different nodes around the Atlantic, and they're connected with all of them. And the practice of Islam is something that mediates all of it and allows them to in essence, create their living. And so what I started to discover in looking at all of these figures and what sort of united them and made them stand out and be so interesting to me was that they created a kind of alternate modern identity. So they had all been exposed to Western modernity and diaspora through crafts, education, economics, and all of those other things that we've been talking about. But they were largely free of the European hegemony of Christian communities. Right? And this is why mosques would take this particular architectural style. The Christian communities would be dominated by Christian clergy. So English missionaries, for example, would want churches built in the English style. French Catholic priests would want their churches built in the French Catholic style. But the Muslims didn't have any European oversight. They were free to build things however they wanted. And so they drew on this Brazilian connection as the way to do it. But nonetheless, they had an understanding of and fairly positive relationships with Christians and Christianity, whether it was the Protestant church through CMS, the Church Missionary Society, through the British, or Catholicism through the experience in Brazil and with Portuguese. They forged alliances with non-colonial international powers, including like the Muslim community in Great Britain and then also the Ottomans. And they had an incredible amount of economic success. The material culture was fairly impressive. They had high levels of education, both in the Islamic educational tradition and the Western educational tradition. And their broad worldview, all of these things together commanded a fair amount of respect, even from the colonial administration. And so you'll see in the ways the colonial governors of Lagos, for example, or even places like Porto Novo, they'll discuss those who had recently converted to Christianity as kind of poor imitations of white people, whereas the Muslims they would describe as earning a bit more respect and being a bit more respectable. I'm trying to remember which one of these very famous Yoruba missionaries it was. I want to say it was James Johnson, said that he wished his congregation could behave or conduct themselves the way that the Muslim community did. So even within Christian communities and the colonial administration, these Muslim Black Atlantic communities garnered a fair amount of respect all around or all across the board. And again, this is because they offered a third option of engaging in modernity without accepting European hegemony and prejudice wholesale. So getting some of the benefits of activity or engagement with the modern world while still resisting some of the things that they did not approve of. And ultimately, this offered a very strong counter narrative to the emerging racial order, right? That positioned European identity and certainly racial identity up at the top. And that Africans were supposedly not supposed to be able to accomplish anything similar, or at least it would take a long time for them to be able to do that. But Muslims who had integrated themselves into the Atlantic world were able to do many of those things and demonstrate they could organize their own communities, they could build elaborate mosques, they could master Western education while still maintaining their own intellectual traditions. So many of the prejudicial assumptions that were baked into the civilizing process in all of these colonies, whether it be Lagos or Dahomey or Sierra Leone, were strongly challenged by them. And we think this made their identity and their practice of Islam very attractive. And this man here, Chief Imam L.B. Agosto, was the child of Aguda, or Brazilian returnees to Lagos, and he became the chief imam of the Lagosian community. He was also the first African to pass the bar or become a lawyer in the modern Western tradition. Of course, there were lots of Muslim jurists, but this was in 1924, I believe, and it's no coincidence that the first Muslim lawyer was a member of the kind of Muslim Black Atlantic because of their long history of interaction or engagement with Western education. And he was a very strong advocate of the benefits of Western education in the emerging order. And so I think one of the most significant implications of the particularities of a Muslim Black Atlantic identity is that it could explain the rapid expansion of Islam in the colonial era. And it's an avenue I think most people haven't considered too strongly just yet. And so I'd like to return to Edward Wilmot Blyden, that man from the Dutch West Indies who went to seminary in Liberia because he was denied admission in the United States. So he was trained and became an ordained Presbyterian minister. And he wrote widely on his experiences all over West Africa and the role that religion played in those communities. And many of his publications were compiled into this fairly well-known book, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. And in this book, he's a surprising advocate for Islam and seems to argue that, at least in the ways they're articulated in West Africa, Islam was better suited for African populations and communities. And he received a fair amount of criticism for this, and some people defended him, but he thought that Islam was better suited for Africans, especially at this time and in this place. Also, despite the colonial support, Christianity expanded much more slowly in areas that had a Muslim presence. And this is curious when you think that, of course, there was colonial support, but then they also had the added benefit of colonial or mission schools, right, which drew a lot of people in and then were also used to propagate the faith. And there's a standard narrative around polygamy and native dress, and perhaps a distrust of colonial power being one of the reasons why West Africans were more eager to adopt Islam rather than Christianity. But as you can see in the previous slide, many of the members of the Muslim Black Atlantic had no problem incorporating Western dress into their wardrobes to a certain extent. And even some Christian communities allowed polygamy to a certain degree. But I think this isn't a fully satisfactory explanation. I think a greater sense of transnationalism and universalism demonstrated by this Atlantic, Muslim Black Atlantic community would be very, very appealing for those who were considering one of the Abrahamic faiths. And I think in particular, the presence of Abdullah Quilliam was quite prominent or left a mark on people like Edward Wilmot Blyden. And in some ways, I think it's the opposite or the reverse of what happened when Malcolm X went on Hajj. So, Malcolm X goes on Hajj and then he sees white Europeans from Bosnia who don't discriminate against him because he's Black, and he realizes that racism isn't endemic to all white people, right? And it changes his worldview. I think having a white person who embraces Islam on his own and then comes to West Africa and is embraced as a brother and treats the Muslim community in both Sierra Leone and Lagos without the kind of prejudice that the colonial administrators or the European missionaries and even some of the indigenous, right, or some of the African missionaries themselves did, left a very strong mark on him and many of the members of Lagosian society at the time. And so in total, the Muslim Black Atlantic figures and their communities had less fraught relationships with indigents, and they had more respect from colonial power because they didn't look down on the native population as much, but they offered a way to kind of operate on equal footing, be every bit as successful and master the modern world without having to subject themselves to European hegemony. This seemed like a very good third option to many people. And so, for example, in Lagos around the turn of the century, there were about twice as many Muslims as there were Christians, despite the fact that missionaries had been active for about half a century and they had their colonial schools or the mission schools and all of those other things. So the rates of conversion and the numbers were actually, there was quite a significant difference between the two of them. And ultimately, this Muslim Black Atlantic community fell into decline in the early 20th century, and that's primarily because trade was what supported these connections between the homeland and the diaspora. And increased colonial control diverted these trade routes to the metropolises from the Americas and other places in Africa. So if you were in Porto Novo, for example, and you were used to trading directly with Rio de Janeiro or Salvador, then now you're having to deal almost exclusively with the French. Or if you're in Lagos and you're used to trading with both Salvador and Freetown, you're maybe dealing with Freetown a little bit, but it's mostly just with the British in England. Furthermore, World War I disrupted all of these trade routes across the Atlantic. Nobody was sailing across the waters nearly as much then, and it was a lot harder to get them restarted afterwards. And then around that same time, when European control was being tightened, there was a racial preference for white merchants and white trading firms that were established there, and they systematically forced out many of the African trading firms, which were dominated by these returnee communities. In addition, the hardening of political boundaries between predominantly French and English colonies also made this movement across colonial borders much more difficult than it had been previously. Nonetheless, the Muslim Black Atlantic identity, I think, has left a permanent and fairly significant mark if you know where to look or how to identify it. And as I mentioned before, some of the chief imams and leaders of Muslim communities still come from these Muslim Black Atlantic families. And sometimes it's hard to see because they'll still carry, say, a Portuguese last name, and it might be a Portuguese last name that has ties to Catholicism or alludes to it. So if you see it written down, you'll just assume this person isn't Muslim. But of course, that's not always the case. There's a fairly prominent tradition of what we call Islamia schools in Nigeria, or at least in Anglophone West Africa. They're oftentimes called medersas in Francophone West Africa, which are schools that combine traditional Islamic education with Western education. And they became fairly popular, especially in the kind of mid 20th century, and then especially later on. But you can see with these Muslim Black Atlantic communities that because they had already been exposed to Western education and seen its value and importance in the modern world, they had begun doing something similar. So the chief imam in Lagos, Agosto, that I mentioned, he was educated in a Catholic school because he was a member of this Brazilian returnee community. And so he received his Islamic education alongside a Catholic or Christian education. And he was one of the people who advocated first for combining these two in one school. The history of largely peaceful relations between Christians and traditionalists is another one that's very, that you can find antecedents in the Muslim Black Atlantic context, and the strong presence of Islam in cities previously dominated by Christian powers or missionaries, I think is also a direct legacy there. So I mentioned in a city like Agwe, where there were not previously many or any Muslims, it was the returnee community that brought the practice of Islam and established it or set the contours or the foundations for how it would be practiced going forward. And the architectural vocabulary of West African mosques very frequently still carries a number of the aspects of Muslim Black Atlantic kind of church mosques. So you can see here, this is Mosquée de la Divinité in Dakar or Wakam. If any of you have ever seen it, it's an incredibly beautiful mosque. It's like a very famous landmark in Dakar, but it has these curious double minarets that are right at the front of the mosque. And I would argue this is just because many mosques in West Africa they've adopted that as part of the common architectural vocabulary that you can pick apart from or divorce from the broader Afro-Brazilian tradition of building kind of church mosques. So you don't need to incorporate all of the details, but many of them do have these two bell towers at the front, or they were bell towers on churches, but they're now actually minarets. And what's interesting about them is this square bell tower tradition, which is very common in Iberia, is actually a repurposing of minarets that were built by the Almohads and the Almoravids in Iberia. They were very famous for building these kind of square minarets, which got turned into bell towers and then got turned from bell towers into minarets on the West African coast. This flag here is of the Tabon population in Accra in Ghana, which is composed primarily of African Muslims who returned after the Mali Rebellion of 1835. This isn't the normal flag that they usually fly. It's usually a Brazilian flag, but it has the star and crescent in the middle, and then it says Olorun underneath. And Olorun is Yoruba for God. The population was mostly Hausa and Yoruba. But Islam was the religion that the vast majority of them practiced. So Islam, a previous Brazilian identity, and then a common commitment to the service of God for those who were not Muslim as well, as kind of the basis of their identity. And they brought the first modern trades, like making shoes, sewing, Western clothes, and then also a lot of construction trades and things that we talked about before. They were the ones who brought that to Accra. And this population is still very much present and alive today there. There's also a surprising survival of some of the remaining mosques from the golden era of the Muslim Black Atlantic. So some of the pictures that I showed you before are taken from those that are still around. And we were just talking earlier about the Sheikh at the Islamic Center in Salvador, Sheikh Abu Bakr, who is here. He is a Yoruba man who was educated in Saudi Arabia, but he was brought in to lead the Islamic community in Salvador because of this history of exchange between West Africa and Brazil. And the community is doing fairly well. It's thriving and growing by all estimates, in large part because he's able to understand the context of the society there and interact well with the Catholics and the Christians, and with those who practice kind of indigenous or traditional African religions or their diasporic variants. And so in all of these ways, I mean, transnationalism, being able to work across ethnic lines, and then engaging deeply with the forces of modernity in a very broad and kind of expansive sense, is something that characterizes this Muslim Black Atlantic experience. And I think we can still find in many ways in West Africa today and also in the diaspora if we know how to look for it. Thank you.
So now we have opportunity for questions, responses. Fascinating lecture. Please. So thank you for the brilliant talk. I love the way that you connected dots across so many I was wondering if you could help at least me understand a little bit more about the process of migration in Brazil, which is something that I project with students from the Institute of Slavery in America. Why would an enslaver grant freedom to purchasing to a person? And then the second question I wanted you to explore was the returnees. So I'm quite familiar with the returnees to Lagos, but what about areas where it's people that taken earlier, like Senegal, Gambia,
femininity contest culture, but it almost mimics the masculinity contest cultures. It's a strange.
Right, thank you. Oh yeah, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, Professor.
Oh man.
So you have to go through all of it.
I'm not sure I can remember my question. Okay, so first of all, I complimented Dr. Ogunnaike on his brilliant talk. But I wanted him to help us understand the process of manumission in Brazil in particular. He talked about urban slaves, and I wanted to understand how could you purchase your freedom? Why would an enslaver agree even for the financial return to grant you your freedom? And then I also wanted to know if there were returnees to areas where the transatlantic slave trade had started earlier than the parts of West Africa that he talked about. But in specifically, I mean Senegambia and West Central Africa, right? So Angola, Congo, and so on.
Oh, well, thank you for the question. And I think maybe I'll just hold the mic so then I can give it to whoever is next. So to take the questions in order, the nature of slavery in Brazil was quite different, obviously, to what it was in the US. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was very possible for an enslaved person to take a slave holder to court if he refused to accept money for manumission. So if there was an enslaved person who said, I have the money to buy my freedom and I want to do it, here's the money. If the slave master or so-called slave master said or refused to accept the money, then the enslaved person could take him to court. Now, I don't want to say that that system was perfect, and I'm sure there were lots of ways to manipulate the system to ensure that it didn't quite work out. But that I know of cases in which that happened, and enslaved people would actually win. So as long as you were able to acquire enough money, generally speaking, it was possible to do it. And that's why these rotating credit associations were so helpful, because if you could get enough money within 1 or 2 rounds to buy one person's freedom, then that person now has the rights to all of his, the fruits of all of his labor. So you'll be able to get much more money, much more quickly, and you can lift the whole group. And when you already have these ganadores were organized into things called cantos. They're working groups. They would all work together in specific trades, and they were oftentimes organized around ethnic and or religious lines. So you'd have a whole group of Muslims who spend all day together working or studying when they're not working. they could buy their freedom in turn, each one of them. And if there was a problem, they could pool their resources to take whoever it was who didn't want to allow them to buy their freedom to court. And that's why you see such a high rate of people who are able to buy their freedom. And then we're also well off enough to be able to buy passage from Brazil back to West Africa. And that was something you didn't see as much in the US, and you didn't find in lots of places in the Caribbean as well. And I think that was fairly unique to Brazil. So it's an excellent question, because that wouldn't have happened in the US. There's so many examples of people getting the money and then the owner saying, no, it's more lucrative for me to keep you. But they weren't allowed to do that, at least ostensibly by law. With respect to returnees for these other areas, in the Senegambia, I don't think it was terribly common. I'm trying to think of any prominent examples, and I'm coming up short. So it doesn't mean that there weren't any, it just means I'm not terribly aware of them. With respect to Central Africa, though, absolutely. There was a very long history of contact between mostly Rio de Janeiro, but also Bahia and Central Africa. So in what's now the Congo and Angola, there were a large number of people who returned to some of those areas, and there are still, communities of people who came directly from Brazil. And I can't remember the name of this battle, but there was a battle that a Congolese king fought with the Portuguese and defeated them. And one of the conditions was that they bring a large number of nobles who had been enslaved previously by the Portuguese, bring them back. And it happened relatively quickly, because the shipping lines connecting those two areas were traveled so frequently that it wasn't very difficult to organize it. So movement, I was mostly focusing on West Africa because that's where the Muslims were. There are very few Muslims in that Central African area. One thing I would like to look into is in Mozambique, because there were some Muslims in that area. I don't know exactly how that connection between the Indian Ocean trade and spread of Islam might have connected to this Atlantic world. It's something I don't think anyone has ever looked at too much, and I would like to look into. But for Central Africa, Islam didn't really factor in as much, so I didn't deal with that here. But you're right that there was also a returnee population there.
Hi, Professor Ogunnaike, thank you very much for this very interesting, informative presentation. My question regards the connection of African Muslims, both enslaved in Brazil and Bahia, and those one who returned, their connections with the Sufi orders. There is a very interesting debate in the scholarship regarding the association of the so-called Malays who revolted in 1835 with the Sufi orders, but we lack sources, evidence for that. There is just one actually a sort of note that one of the Malays sent to his master, and his name was Abdul al-Qadir, and through that people are like making connection with the quadrilla. Yeah, and but I would like to know if you, through your research, you came across like stronger connections.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and one I've thought about myself as well. If there were to be much of a strong Sufi connection, it would likely be the Qadris, because that was spread through Usman Dan Fodio and the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate. I've heard this argument. I think Abdul Qadir is a name that lots of people have, whether they're Qadri or not. So I wouldn't read too much into that. I haven't seen anything definitive. I do think if we're able to get a greater analysis of some of the documents that have survived, we might be able to see if they are ones that, there are certain materials that are studied primarily by or associated more closely with particular Sufi orders. And so if we find those present, either in partial or complete form, that might indicate more strongly that, okay, these whoever it was who produced the document might have been a member of that Sufi order. What I can say for sure, though, that's it's harder to tell in Brazil. What I do know, though, is Abunkare, the man on whom Jorge José Reis has written, this book. When he was studying in Sierra Leone, there was a large influence of the Tijaniya. And the leader of the Muslim community in Freetown there, this man I mentioned, Muhammad Yadaliu, had been initiated into the Tijaniya before he started teaching people there. And it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to me that that Abunkari might have also himself either become a Tijani before, or certainly when he was studying in Sierra Leone, because it would offer a number of benefits. Yeah, both existential and spiritual. And I think it would have been quite attractive to somebody like him. But the only way to know that for sure, I think, would be to like go back and look at some of the like primary sources in depth and know what to look for, like specifically what documents or even allusions to like the type of initiation that they would receive in those traditions. And that would be pretty difficult to get. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you, but I do think that the Qadariya might have been present in Brazil, especially amongst the Hausa and the Fulani, because they would have, many of them who had been fighting on the side of Usman Dan Fodio would likely have been members of the Qadariya. And then also the Tijani I know was present in Sierra Leone. And so a figure like Abu Kari would have been exposed to it. Whether or not he, like took the weird of the Tijaniya or not is another question. Yeah. If I find anything about that, I'll be sure to email you though.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering how you are defining modernity in the book, and particularly how it connects to your perception of your intervention into the literature on diaspora. You rely heavily upon Gilroy, obviously, and he was not concerned with Africa. So I'm wondering how you're framing that.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think the way I'm considering modernity here, certain aspects of individual identity, but in particular, a new kind of identity or sphere of activity that exists outside of the traditional structures, right? And so, for example, Mohammed Chitabe, he was part of a scholarly lineage, and his lineage identity was very important to him. But he was the one who had all of these titles himself individually, right? Which is a bit different from the way that it may have worked in the past. And he also, even his title, Sheriki Muslimi.
The nursing literature, there's, I think when there are some like
the titles that he acquired them outside of the normal ways that people would have done it previously, right? So these are kind of new ways that you could acquire wealth, certainly on an individual level in ways that you couldn't have before, and social prestige in ways that exist like outside of the traditional or pre-existing power structures. Another way that I would define modernity here is like a particular form of literacy. So Islamic literacy was always part of these Muslim communities for sure, but engagement with Western literacy was something that was quite new and hadn't been a part of their world before. And then also this exposure to an engagement and activity with the broader Atlantic world, which is a fundamental part of, I think, the kind of broader Atlantic modern identity, is certainly one that would be characteristic of this group as well. With respect to the intervention, right, Gilroy didn't focus that much on Africa. I think he does have some references to like newspapers and artistic forms that like draw a little bit on it, but he wasn't terribly concerned with Africa. The United States and Great Britain is really what he's thinking about. And personally, I think that's a mistake. I think especially when we're talking about Muslims, though, you can't do that. It just doesn't work. But I think the example of the Muslim Black Atlantic demonstrates how Great Britain was connected with Sierra Leone and with Lagos, and Lagos was connected with Brazil. And I didn't talk about it all that much, but there were also Cuban returnees. The population was much smaller. And so the picture, I think, is much more diverse. And Gilroy himself doesn't speak about religion all that much. I mean, you make some references to Christianity, perhaps, because it's part of the broader culture. But he certainly isn't talking about Islam, and he doesn't make religion a kind of central focus. Whereas I think for this particular population, Islam has everything to do with just about everything. Islam was integrated into the trading networks. Islam was integrated into the way they approached education, both traditions of education that they were involved in. Islam was the way that they mediated their transnational their transnational connections and all of those kinds of things. And so I think that's how I would add on to what Gilroy has done. And then one of the interventions with respect to diaspora studies, again, is that I think the homeland is very much affected by the diaspora. In some of these places, the major port cities in West Africa, the practice of Islam was founded by diaspora communities. And so you can't actually understand the homeland without also understanding the diaspora. And so it's kind of like a constant movement. I view them as more of a linked sphere rather than one being a kind of baseline and then the other one being one that you study in terms of like divergences or evolutions from it. The way like Herskovits, for example, would have looked at it like, oh, survivals from the homeland. No, I actually think what happened in the diaspora in many ways informs the form that the traditions take in the homeland. So I think that's one of the major interventions that I might try to make on the way that we approach some traditions in West Africa in light of experience in diaspora.
Okay. So I have a couple of questions, Professor. I really appreciate I mean, one of the things that comes out of your presentation is the relationship between Africa and diaspora. And I think I mean, this is something that with which I completely agree with you that, you know, the trajectories, the vectors of influence and so forth, intellectual influence, people moving and so forth, is not one way. And I think that, you know, your scholarship and your presentation this evening is making that point. And so I applaud you for that. And I actually think that I may differ a little bit with you in that I do think that African studies is moving in that direction and is incorporating more and more of diasporic content and perspective into its work. All right. But so the way you began the presentation was really, really, we could talk about that all night because here you have Muhammad Shita Bey there with Blyden. Yeah. So, you know, I'm really curious to know more about that. You know, just, you know, what was the nature of their relationship? But we could talk about that another time. I think more, I'm really interested in, and it connects with Professor Badassi's question about your concept of modernity, because there are some inferences in your presentation and they're not necessarily clear to me. And you gesture toward a kind of trans-regionalism or transnational, I don't know if the transnationality is the word, but a kind of trans-regionalism that is facilitated through Islam, yeah, which in turn is facilitated by this association with commerce. Yeah, you know, I think there's a lot of truth to that. It comes a little close to saying that where you have Muslims, you have trade, and I don't know about that, but okay. What is your view then of the relationship? Because you're really kind of gesturing toward this without actually saying it. Are you inferring that Islam is a kind of predicate for what becomes Pan-Africanism? Okay, all right, because this is kind of what's swirling around, right? That is to say, all right, because I wish you would. I mean, that'd be very provocative. That'd be very, very provocative. No, but I mean, but you know, I mean, that's a line of inquiry that I think is. I need to think about that. Yeah, I need to think about that because here you have so you have, you know, Edward Blyden, who is, you know, a major progenitor of Pan-Africanism. he's running around West Africa. You know, he's supposed to be this Christian. He's praying in the mosque, you know, but for all practical purposes, he's a Muslim. He has all these relationships and so forth. And yeah, I mean, there's something there that, and so you have these people going back and forth across the Atlantic and, you know, not just trade associations, but cultural exchanges and so forth and so on. I think we need to think about that. I think we need to think about that a little more clearly. All right. All right. To the architecture. So that wasn't really a question. It's just, I'm just thinking, I mean, this is very, very provocative.
So there's a question on if I have a chapter on Blyden. And so this is very much still a work in progress. I have my first book manuscript hopefully it will be finished with the review process very soon. And once that's done, then I'll be turning to focus more exclusively on this. I do want to have a chapter on why this particular expression of Islam was so attractive. And Blyden is going to be a central figure there. I think he kind of has to be, because it's very curious why someone born in the African diaspora who returns to West Africa to become a Christian minister and spends so much time in predominantly Christian settings and is, you know, so associated with mission schools and that kind of thing, in many ways seems to kind of become a Muslim. And I've also seen that he wrote a proposal to create a Muslim institution of higher learning, I think in Sierra Leone, to be like the counterpart of Furabe, right? So this man clearly thinks Islam is the way to go, from my perspective, for Africans. So how does that happen? And if that's something that happened for a Christian minister, what's happening for everybody else who, you know, has just been exposed to Islam and Christianity for the first time, right? And so I think Blyden is such an important figure in all of that. And to link that to Professor Gomez's comment or contribution, I don't want to say that Islam was a precursor to Pan-Africanism necessarily. I think you could potentially make the argument, the way I understand this particular community at least, is that they made links between multiple different African communities on the basis of Islam, and viewed themselves to a certain extent in opposition to European colonial forces, which is very, very Pan-African. But they were also creating a kind of Pan-Islamic identity with Abdullah Quilliam and Muslims in Great Britain, and then, you know, with the Ottoman Empire. And I don't know how much, say, they were thinking of themselves with relationship to Muslims in, say, East Africa, or like Africans all across the continent. They may very well be doing that, but it seemed like Islam was such a central part of it that was linking African communities together, that I don't know if I could make that case convincingly. I think I would like to, like you, and I think it's something that I think it wouldn't be too difficult to jump from this way of defining a Muslim, an African Muslim identity, to defining a broader Pan-African identity. And maybe this is one of the key ingredients for Blyden in getting there and saying, look, Islam offers a way to be very African and to resist a lot of the problems with European modernity. And so we can, perhaps we can turn to the African tradition of Islam to do this. I don't disagree with you, and I wouldn't want to say that I think it isn't a precursor to Pan-Africanism. I'm just not certain that I can fully make that case just yet. But maybe in time, as I do more research on it, I could, and I appreciate the nudge to consider it more seriously, because it would be a great argument to be able to make. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop there.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to monopolize this, but this is, we have a little time, so I want to have we're having a conversation, no? So, yeah, because, you know, in the North American context, Islam it very much becomes the conduit through which a lot of Pan-Africanist activity is taking place. I'm struck by Muhammad, just the term, the name, Muhammad Shita Bey, because at the same time that this is happening in West Africa, Moorish Science Temple is jumping off right here. And the names, the surnames are Bey and Il. So there are yeah, something is happening here that, and I'm not trying to suggest at all that Islam, because I want to contrast that. I want to contrast what's happening in what's happening in the Atlantic, if you will, with what's happening just to the north in West Africa. All right, I'm curious to hear what you think about this, because what I'm seeing here, when you talk about modernity, and you said it more than once in your construction of it, you seem to be saying that these are people who can negotiate multiple worlds. They are familiar with Islam. They are familiar with Christianity. They are familiar with European culture. They're familiar with African culture. They're familiar with Brazilian culture. They're cosmopolitan. Maybe they're the first Afropolitans. I don't know. But they move in all of these circles at the same time. And that's what I'm hearing. Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. And it strikes me as being very highly generative. And I just want to think about it some more. But just to the north, in the Sahel, I think you have a different kind of Islam that's developing. It's very anti-colonial. It's very anti-French. It's highly antagonistic. It is not, I mean, in some ways it is, it's I mean, people, I mean, Halaj Omar and all these other people are prosecuting holy war, and it's a very stern approach to the religion, just to the north of what you're talking about. Yeah. So Black people are involved in all of in at least two very, very different formations. And the last thing I want to say, with respect to the architecture of the mosque. Yeah, man, we have to talk about this, because here we're thinking, I'm looking at this mosque, right? That kind of looks like a cathedral. All right. And what you're saying a couple of things. You're saying, well, actually, when you go to Iberia, what was going on in Iberia was based upon the masjid, all right, brought by the Almoravids and the Almohads. Okay, so that's good. I don't know if the West Africans knew that. All right. So, but in their construction of this mosque, is it but is it principally about a projection of power? Is it a statement about status? Or coming out of Brazil, okay, where Africans know how to engage in very sophisticated ways of approaching religion. Is this structure saying something about Islam's relationship to monotheism? And yeah, I mean, is this a philosophical statement? That's what I'm wondering, and I'm done.
The first thing I noticed when I saw, even before in your article you published with this journal at Yale, they look like a Baroque Rococo style. It's Baroque style, and you have a clear affirmation of the arabesques there, like, which could be Romanesque arabesque, but could also be Iberian arabesque. So I was wondering, drawing what Professor Gomez just said, did you find any other connection with this facade and the mentality of African Muslims, what they were doing by what they appropriated from the Baroque and Rococo style?
Well, so I think what you're alluding to here really is a certain kind of aesthetic sensibility, right? And it was one that was brought by the Berber powers into, what became Al-Andalus. So this focus on ornate, I guess ornamentation, sorry, or very kind of flamboyant ornamentation on the surfaces of buildings. And the particular kind of segmentations that they have, the type of colors and things that were used. The arabesques, I mean, the fact that it's even called arabesque should give you a bit of an idea of actually where this comes from, right? And you find it, there's a really great book, I wish I could remember the name of the author right now, but it's called Stealing from the Saracens, that addresses the Islamic origins of much of Gothic European architecture. And so many of these features, especially the Baroque in Iberia, are drawn directly from the Almohads and the Almoravids. And I could go into a much lengthier description of exactly what features those are and how they were appropriated and then reproduced in Brazil and then recreated in West Africa. But this orientation to a kind of the weight of the aesthetic experience of looking at it or seeing it is part of what part of the purpose of creating buildings in this architectural style. And I think it absolutely is a statement. I wouldn't separate a philosophical and theological statement apart from this notion of projecting power. Because I think those two things can go very much hand in hand, right? The idea that you can create something that's so incredibly beautiful and transmits a kind of divine sense of power, which can be mediated through transnational connections and linked to centers of affluence and all of those other kinds of
What we're
things.
thinking is, like, so this is kind of like,
But
this is
also a
the
connection to
alternate.
Christianity where you've almost kind of superseded it, right? Like this is architecture that we know has been used in the past for Christianity, but we can also repurpose it, right? This is something that we can and have mastered, much like Western education, much like trade routes that were dominated by Europeans. This is something that we have made our own and we can reproduce in creative ways ourselves. And so they don't just reproduce it wholesale. In the article that you just mentioned, talk about how you can't fully see it here, but there are lots of inscriptions. And that was a unique thing about Iberian Baroque churches and architecture. And they took those, but they did the inscriptions in Arabic, right? They do all kinds of other interesting things like putting the star and the crescent on there. And they do other interesting things like in the inside where instead of the apse of the church, they'll put the mihrab in, right? And so they adjust all kinds of things to make it more suitable for Islamic purposes. Again, building on a model of Christianity, but superseding it, which has clear antecedents in the history of Islam itself. And I don't think that that's, fully a mistake. I think they're doing it fairly intentionally. I don't think they were fully aware of the Islamic roots of much of the Iberian architecture and that tradition. I think very few people actually are. And I shared with Professor Gomez myself that some people didn't like me pointing those things out because we have clear divisions between European and African, when in fact, that part of Europe was very, very African and also very, very Islamic. To this day, huge parts of it are still very, very Islamic, even if people are no longer practicing Islam there. So I think I would agree with you that it's not just, okay, we're affluent and we're powerful. I think they are making a statement about Islam and Islam's presence. And I think they did it very, very well because many of these monuments still stand today. And even the Europeans who didn't like Islam or Muslims or Africans all loved them. And it was one of the primary ways that they changed their way of thinking.
What you just said is very important because you now you get into function, and it seems to me it's so this. I know this is not candomblé. I understand that, but it seems that one of the principles, and I know there are debates about candomblé. All right, but it seems to me that one of the ideas behind candomblé is that you want to achieve a kind of an association between Yoruba religion and Catholicism, if for no other reason than to defend yourself. That is to say, not to hide the religion, not to hide the Yoruba, the Yoruba aspect of it, but to provide, to give yourself some defense, okay? And in a place, especially after 1835, I guess, but in a place that's hostile to Islam. This might be something that, people would see and say, okay, well, we're not going to attack this place. We're not going to burn it down. This is not an affront to Catholicism. This seems to be, somehow consistent with our own tradition. I'm just wondering about the functionality of it as well. Yeah. I'm really done.
Well, one thing I think I might say in response there is since my initial field was, the study of indigenous Yoruba religion, and then I branched off into Candomblé, my take on the issue of syncretism between Catholicism and Yoruba tradition centers around, and many of the people I interviewed in Brazil, confirm this, around the Yoruba notion of ashe, or like, I hate to call it sacred power. That's usually how it's translated, but in reality, it's just power, because there's no separation between secular and sacred in most traditional African societies. So whatever is powerful or efficacious, you work with it. And the divisions like European or African don't really matter, especially when life is very difficult and you're persecuted. Any port in a storm, right? You use whatever you have at hand to get what you need. And I think Black people have always been very, very good at that, wherever you find them, both on the continent and in diaspora. And I don't think this type of architecture is terribly different, right? You find whatever kind of power or tools you can get, regardless of the origins necessarily, and you're more focused on its utility. How can it get you what you need, or how can it serve the ends that your particular community has at that particular point in time? And so, I could refer back to like your work on exchanging country marks, right? Or you could look at a tradition like conjure and say like, okay, well, you just kind of like added some African stuff onto Christianity. And I'd say, well, no, you're actually getting it wrong. What's actually happening here is you have a particular African orientation to the divine or to power, or whatever you want to call it. And then you use the material that you have at hand, and then you integrate it into that process. And I think that's exactly what's happening here. And I think it was incredibly effective. So I would very much agree with you that, it might not be exactly the same thing as syncretism between a Yoruba deity and a Catholic saint, but it's not too dissimilar in that it's a clear engagement with Catholicism. You're appropriating huge parts of that type of material culture, and then you're reproducing it, albeit in a different form and in a slightly different context. But it would be a mistake to identify this as like Catholicism, right? Which is oftentimes what people do. And one of the other things I didn't get into here as much, but I make in the article on architecture, is there's this constant prejudice against African Muslims as being somewhat syncretic, and that, oh, you're combining African traditions or other traditions with Islam, and so it's not pure Islam, which I think is complete and utter nonsense and very prejudicial. There's nothing un-Islamic about this, particularly because it has deep roots in Islamic architecture in North Africa itself. But even if it didn't, I'm not sure why it would be un-Islamic necessarily. And I wouldn't view it as syncretic. It's not like an inappropriate mixture of different things. It's not a kind of bastardized or compromised form of Islam. I think it's just a particular way of articulating it that is influenced by the culture and its surroundings. And that, I think, is very different from the kind of pejorative connotations that oftentimes come with syncretism, of saying like, these are things that should never have anything to do with each other. And if you were more devoted to your religious tradition, you would know that, and then you would never allow these kinds of things to happen. There are highly educated West African Muslims who are engaged in this kind of process. If there were any kind of problem with Islamic law or orthodoxy, they would have blown a whistle. This was just a very effective and appropriate way of articulating Muslim identity in that particular context at that particular time. And I think Africans have been good at that for a long time, but it always draws a certain amount of prejudice, or people look down their noses at it. But I think it's a matter of orientation. If you don't mind me going back to the two different ways West Africans kind of responded to European colonialism, I completely agree. El Hajj Omar Tal why am I blanking? Yeah, Samori Toure. Very, very different response, right, to the French from Mohamed Chitabe, for example. Right? But I think part of the difference is Samori Toure and most of his followers were never swept up in the transatlantic slave trade and didn't spend, say, like decades in Cuba or Brazil or, you know, the United States. I think that type of experience demonstrates, look, this world is here and it's here to stay. It might be very difficult for us to completely fight against it militarily, but we can carve a place for ourselves out within this world, which in fact is actually what you see in Senegal later on with, say, like Sheikh Amadou Bamba, right? And there's that whole debate about, you know, the two different ways, especially in that area, that like different movements responded to the French, collaboration and resistance. And I don't have a particular stance on either one of those, but you can see how later on, when colonial rule has been more firmly established, you also see some responses to European power that are a bit more similar to, you know, what I'm identifying here in the Muslim Black Atlantic. People mastering kind of both traditions rather than outright resisting one, you know, completely the way Samori Toure might have, for example. And I think the experience in diaspora has quite a lot to do with that. And that's part of the reason why you wouldn't see it a little bit farther north. Interestingly enough, though, there are some church mosques that were built in the Senegambian region along this model. And I need to do a little bit more research on it. Cleo Cantone has written a little bit about it, and she hypothesizes that there might have been Brazilian returnees from the Bight of Benin who traveled up that way. I know there are traders from that area who made their way up there as well. But it is curious that this Luso Catholic tradition of architecture was recreated there at this around the same time that Afro-Brazilian returnees were coming to West Africa, and not sooner. So it seems like they might have had something to do with it, but I haven't been able to prove the historical link. So even there, they did seem to embrace this architectural tradition to a much more limited extent, not as much as in the Bight of Benin, but even a little bit there as well. I also agree with you. I don't think that everywhere you have Muslims, you have traders. I don't think that's a case. I didn't mean to suggest that. I just know everywhere that you have trade routes and Muslims are present, Islam tends to spread. As you have African Muslims moving along and engaging in trade routes, the faith always seems to spread. I don't know if I've ever come across any trade route in which Muslims have been active that other people haven't started to embrace the religion or it hasn't moved along. But even some of the scholars themselves were merchants. Abunkare himself was involved in trade. That was what he was doing primarily even before he started making his living through scholarship. And even when he was primarily making his living through scholarship, he was still involved in trade to one degree or the other. But yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to reduce it to just all Muslims are traders. Everywhere you see trade or everywhere you see Islam, that's the primary thing that people are engaged in.
Okay, well, we gotta stop.
Oh, which one? Sorry, I'm not sure. My book, the one that I'm hoping is coming out soon. Yeah, that one is called Forms of Worship, how Orisha devotion became a religion in Nigeria and Brazil. So that's hopefully going to be published with Duke University Press fairly soon. But yeah, we'll see what the reviewers have to say about that.
You want to thank the professor? I want to thank everyone in Zoom land. This concludes our session for the evening.